So, good morning or hello, whatever, to the ladies and gentlemen joining us for another space today. Um, we are going to talk about something that was beginning to become extremely suspicious by already end of November 2024. People from the TG can vouch for me and others pointing out a complete discrepancy in some visually confirmed losses, especially on the Ukrainian side, which was not compatible with the posture that they would have normally. During the month of December, this basically took off, and we were to levels of losses on the Ukrainian side, which were absolutely not normal. With regards to both 2023, 2024, and even the early stages of 2022. So, first and foremost, those losses are literally traceable and visible on Oryx. Once again, you may like or not like Oryx, we don't use it as a referential itself. As I said, we have our own loss counter in the Timor criminal group. But if you notice that even Oryx cannot hide the losses and is showing a certain tendency, then you need to actually take notice and start thinking about what's going on. Right now we're suffering from a small lack of, transparency with the battlefield. We are seeing a lot of vehicles being destroyed left and right. For Kursk, we have our very own Prizrak doing a geolocation of the losses, which then we can translate into different phases of how the Kursk operation was going and is going. But for Pokrovsk, Kharkov, and Svatovo Liman line, for instance, we are literally doing that a bit as a piecemeal account. So, using Oryx gives us the strict minimum we can expect it, and that's how, as I said, you can simply start noticing a very funny pattern, which is we jump from early 2023 up to the counter, so in June, roughly 4.8 assets lost per day. You go at 8.9 after the counter. Then you restart the year 2024 at 7-8 per day assets lost, and then you have Kursk coming up, it shoots up to 10, and the average up around November stays around 8.4, which is extremely high compared to 2023. While, of course, as I said, 2023, you had a waiting phase, a re-equipment, refit phase for the Ukrainian forces, with one or two attempts to disrupt the Russian defenses. March 2023 attempts to Belgorod. March 2023 attempts to disrupt Novodanilovka and Robotin direction, which was as I said, in my opinion, was a dry run for the operation that was going to follow in June 2023. And then you got the counter. As I said, counter literally doubles the losses. According to Oryx, according to us, it's completely different. But if you just keep Oryx, you can understand that the posture changes in 2023 with the counter. That stuff lasts roughly 2.5 months with enough pressure to basically shave off most of the donated equipment to the Ukrainian forces for that counter. Then it dies down around the month of October 2023, and then you have the current phase of operational initiative, which is on the Russian side firmly, except the small adventure in Kursk, but we're here to speak about it. And the amount of losses daily just doesn't change. Once the Russians have put the Ukrainians to the test, and the Ukrainians are losing, as I said, between 8.8 and 10 assets per day, there is no coming back from there. They lower it a little bit early 2024 because the Russians are then pressuring them. and then slowly it goes back to 8.8, and we get to the burst of losses in Kursk, but all over the place actually, where you had 10, 11, 12 losses per day, most of the days until they called off the operational phase of Kursk, because they were literally beaten, they couldn't advance anymore, and they slowly started to get pushed back. But generally speaking, 2024, even based on Oryx, was around 2,500 losses. I think technically rather closer to 3,000, all included. But as I said, this doesn't change much. 3,000, 3,500, and so forth. What is changing though is some specific losses. So on the tank front, given the Ukrainians do not have received much reinforcements, so for 2025 they were already in a net loss, so there was almost nothing given to palliate for the over 300 tanks lost in 2024. So everything that they're going to get, be that the 49 Abrams, the 30 Croatian tanks, some extra trash from Poland or Bulgaria or Romania, that still needs to be determined, and more of the same Bradleys, some M80s from Croatia, as I said, and a couple of other assets are not going to balance out what was lost in terms of heavy armor. This was even made worse by the whole logic of the new brigades being formed. Most of the new brigades are being given refit equipment. One such case was the sudden appearance of storage T80 BVs and T64 BVs over 85s. A couple of them were very visible because the barrels were still with the old Ukrainian colors. And also, as I said, the Luna infrared searchlights started to pop out again on T64s and T80s, of course, but especially on T64s, which meant that these tanks had not been modernized and fit with a Polish-sourced thermal device as the T64 BVs over 2017 and 2022, plus the B1 amps and stuff like that. But once again, all this is completely par for course for the Ukrainian modernization and refit. They are going to I say, a Germany 1944 phase right now, and have made some sound choices when it comes to output, but very bad choices when it comes to potentiality and strength. So basically, when you see them dumping on the battlefield a fuck ton of Cossacks and a fuck ton of senators and a fuck ton of armored cars generally, that's helping them up to a point to get some protection for the troops, but more often than not, it lowers their firepower potential and also gives us a pretty damning dry run of what is to come for 2025. The core aspect of this is what happened very recently in Kursk, that was dubbed a counterattack. Once again, a lot of Russian voyenkors, so basically military correspondents, which we colloquially call vojenkurvas among the team or criminal team, started again with this panic mongering, and of course this time it was absolutely calculated because the attempts from Berlin were tactical in nature. There was nothing there to be gained in terms of expanse of the zone of control within Kursk. The attempt was simply to preempt the Russian pushes on the flanks of Berlin, one that went towards Makhnovka, that today, or rather yesterday, was given as recaptured by the Ukrainians. I do not believe it. What happened to Makhnovka is most than probably a cleanup operation by Ukrainian special forces. This is what's happening most of the time in Kursk. When the Russians are too close for comfort, the Ukrainians do one of these hit and run ops, kill a couple of guys, capture a couple of guys, and then retreat. But when it comes to Makhnovka, Viktorivka, and so on, it's extremely dangerous for them. And Kurtivka is extremely dangerous for them to let the Russians creep there because, as I said, in Makhnovka you are literally 3 kilometers from Suja itself. And once the Russians are penetrating and are starting street fights within Suja, the whole salient is gone. Because your biggest anchor point when you're Ukrainian right now within the Kursk area is Suja. Nothing else is doable. Everything else is too small to be able for you to hide many people. So the Ukrainians tried to get back to Spenivka at the border. They got fucked. Same for the Russians. Russians tried to clear out the demarcation line. Literally, they get also counterattacked by FPVs. So in Kursk right now, you move, you die. You show up, you die. You don't show up, you also die, but it's a bit more complicated. And the Russians still, over 4 months after the initial invasion, still haven't decided to literally blow Suja away. Doing that and then rebuilding it would cost you a lot less in military acumen than actually doing what you're doing right now, which is pressing the Ukrainians to a certain point and then trying to eliminate them, as we're seeing, mostly by individual means. So FPVs, Zalas, some North Korean or indigenized OTA ATGMs and stuff like that. However, while Kursk is understandable why the Ukrainians want to do it, because in a certain sense, whatever remains in Kursk is the only thing that Ukraine can remind the world they had accomplished in 2024. It's the follow-up that is extremely important. So, as I said in a small post yesterday, if you start counting according to Oryx, for what is, you are able to glean, because one of the things that is also happening with Oryx is that while up to mid-2024 you had an almost daily save of the site, so you could follow up the losses day by day, especially on the Russian side, because that was the most important for Westerners. The follow-up, so the recordings, and so therefore the savings of the page for specific dates is almost gone on the Ukrainian side. Very few people have these impressions, so you can verify how it's moving on. And because of that, I think that a lot of people have completely forgotten how the losses on the Ukrainian side have been going. Of course, we haven't, because that's basically our raison d'être at this point. And initially it started with seeing tanks being lost, way more than usually. The Ukrainians would lose and amortize about 300 to 400 tanks per year, based on visual evidence. The issue, though, is that after one strike of the Russian Federation with Iskanders and cluster Iskanders on the tank prom in Kharkov, I think everybody remembers the video. You can see all these tanks scattered, damaged, and being either cannibalized, either awaiting repair of any kind of sort. You start to understand the amount of vehicles we haven't seen being destroyed on the Ukrainian side. And in a certain sense, as I said, the biggest problem is that when you start believing in the fairy tale of visual losses, especially for tanks on the Ukrainian side, you cannot understand why the Ukrainians, that theoretically, I'm going to once again repeat, if you follow up the numbers, visual numbers on the Russian side, losses-wise, so especially captures, Ukrainians should have not, any kind of trouble up to mid-2024 to have T-72s or T-80s to be able to fill up. Instead of that, we have a very slow trickle of all these captured vehicles. Roughly around 122 have been seen so far, while not forgetting that it's still only about 1/5 of what was allegedly captured, based on, of course, Coprix. And then you ask yourself, how the fuck is this possible? Especially as, in the meantime, the vehicles that Ukraine is receiving are, for most part, still Eastern Bloc. So basically, you have this T-72B something. It's damaged up to a certain point, but still repairable. Why the hell doesn't it work with the Poles giving you the part that would fit this tank, and it would allow you to, use it against the Russians? Well, very simple. If you guys had a view on Russian gap to review, Russian mechanized and repair journal for the Russian military, you would understand that one of the stuff that blocked a lot of Russian sustainability initially, so 2022, 2023, was that most of the tanks were still in the juice and they had many uncompatible parts. Not like it wasn't back-breaking because the Russians finally managed to, find parts, build parts, source parts, put these tanks together and send them to the front. But if the Russians have this problem, Ukrainians would have been worse because most of the models they could be finding would be T-72M1s for T-72, and T-64s would be T-64s over 85. So basically stuff that they had sold, for instance, let's say to Congo or to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so forth. So there was nothing in there to help them, refit most of these Russian tanks captured in good enough state, quote unquote. On the other side, even the people who were supposed to help them, the Slovaks and the Czechs for a while, were complaining that nothing was coming forth to their side for refit and refurbishment. On top of it, both the Czechs, the Poles, and the Slovaks were lacking IP. Intellectual property in this case, were lacking IP to be able to, produce gearboxes for the T-64, an extremely complicated task, and gearboxes for Russian source T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s. This more or less gave birth to a couple of extremely nasty hybrids on the Ukrainian side, but more or less it capped the exponential growth of the Ukrainian armored core due to the fact that simply they didn't have the parts to make them run. So right now the Ukrainians have, like you saw in that strike, a huge pool of carcasses from which they are picking stuff up in order to make most of their tanks run. And therefore you have this logic, as I said, that on the Ukrainian side, the biggest problem right now is we do not have heavy assets to support defensive and offensive operations for our troops. Now, the problem with that is that most of the discussion right now has been centered around we're lacking the troops, which is true, and for what they're doing right now, not that much. So suddenly around the month of November, I'm seeing with the other guys, we're seeing like tanks being lost every single day. And you are analyzing it up to the point, as I said, if you base yourself on Oryx, but also with our own counts, suddenly it starts to be dawning as well. There might be something wrong here because it's not like usual when the Ukrainians would do hit and runs, bring the tanks close enough to trenches, limit the area of engagement, contain it enough so that whatever tank they'd be using wouldn't be threatened by UAVs and FPVs on the Russian side. Go there, make a mess, pull back, go there with another unit, capture whatever is remaining, and tada, you have this wonderful advance of 250 meters out of 3 weeks of preparation from the 3rd Azov, and these guys are the best, and Tata Gemi tells you that you should have more assault battalions. And you're like, oh wow. Next day, you see a position of, let's say, the 155th Brigade, coping a fab, and 2 days later, you see on Obits they lost 30 people wounded, killed, and that the commander of the position is a wall or missing in action, so most probably vaporized. And you're like, oh, see, the Russians are losing far more. Look at this wonderful footage on the Ukrainian side. They're advancing. The Russians, whatever advance they have, they cannot defend themselves. And like the PR universe in which the Ukrainians were fighting up to November 2024 was Russian attrition is going to slow them down, going to kill them down. However, since November, as I said, we've seen a raise in actual assets, both employed and lost. And we are down to 82% of losses per engagement, which means that 82% of the tanks being employed for every engagement is getting killed, immobilized, but in any case lost. This is above what the Ukrainians were losing in the Zaporozhye area for 4 months. Initially, they started with about 67 to 68% losses per engagement. Then it went up to 72 to 78, and then it went back to about 60%. And of course, it was mostly lighter vehicle pickups, M113, stuff like that. Here, we are speaking 82% losses of tanks. Literally, you pop out your fucking Ukrainian tank, you're gonna eat a FPV drone. Mostly optifiber, which means that you cannot counter them. Those motherfuckers cannot stop you, and then the Russians are just going to finish you off with whatever they have. Normal FPV, artillery, tank coming by, and so forth and so on. Now, this whole joke about Ukrainian tanks being able to more freely fight and all this nonsense that was picked up by David Axe and Dmitry the Fagot, were translated based on, as I said, most probably a Russian black PR account on TG, which is Vault 8. Why I say black PR? Because the guy has been wrong on absolutely everything. And every single thing he's, producing and posting on Telegram is like, not only cringe, but it's quite, it's just not fake. It's worse than fake because it doesn't exist. There are worse problems in the Russian military and worse problems with the Ukrainian military, but the thing that these guys are inventing or producing via AI or stuff like that, they're just not there yet. There are stuff that might have been existing in 2022, but in 2024-25, we are completely removed from that area. And I'm saying there are worse problems than described from Vault 8. Just that stuff doesn't exist. And I mean, I had made that small thread about how stupid it was, especially Russian tanks are not being used anymore to spread. We are seeing footage every day. Russian tanks only fight from in close position. That was for a long while the specialty of Ukrainian tanks, simply because they had problems with fuel, MTO, ammo, and so forth. And the most important part, as I said, Ukrainian drones are flying free and Russian drones are falling off. As I said, this is bullshit. Both sides have been making strides in electronic warfare. Therefore, the Russians replied and shot first with the optifiber FPVs, which are proving to be an absolute monster game changer at the tactical level. Strategic, as I said, FPVs will not be able to change much unless one of the two sides is depleted enough not to be able to afford the kind of losses that you would get with optifiber FPVs. And on this aspect, Berdin is exactly that. In Berdin, the Ukrainians cobbled up some kind of force, let's call it like that, and this force was not even the good old one that attacked in Veseloy in around September 2024. There you had CVs, you had BTRs, you had VABs, you had actual military equipment thought to be enough to at least have a breakthrough, which would then confuse and pull out the Russians from the direction of the attack they were having, which was basically freeing their side of the Snagos, their bank of the Snagos River. That failed, as you know. We also remember the whole bullshit from 225th battalion on the Ukrainian side who spoke about aggression and promotion and lend-lease and captives and all that stuff. Turned out that within 2 days everything was done. They lost like 22 to 25 vehicles, and they shut the fuck up for not even a week, because a week after they started bullshitting everybody again on how there was a second option. Never happened. Those guys were already killed, and we went back to the good old bullshit of Russians trying to push them out, and the Ukrainians replying by FPVs, and then you know what happened. A bunch of their drone units from 2025 from the Black Swans got captured. Part of it was killed in the trenches, another part was pulled out of the trenches, made to line up, and ventilation behind the skull followed up. You probably remember the butt hurt that we had for weeks. It was fascinating. But now, most importantly, is like, what the fuck is going on? Why suddenly the Ukrainians are going out of their way, risking major assets, and having this shallow counter? Well, it's pretty simple, and I'm going to repeat it. A lot of it has to do with their worldview. On one side, the whole counter was to stop the Russians from getting too close or getting too comfy with Pokrovsk. This idea, I already had a space the 10th of October 2024. There is a channel on YouTube. It's not mine, once again. You just type Radio TWK on YouTube. You're going to find it out. 10th of October 2024, I gave 3 options for the Ukrainians in and around Pokrovsk. And apparently the Ukrainians have chosen the second option. Back then, down to the details. So even the timetable seems to be more or less correct. So basically, by the end of February, they hope to have completely squashed the propelling force of the Russian offensive around Pokrovsk. Enough, again, not to stop it, but to force them to make a choice. Most of the time, what the Ukrainians have tried to do, and this was extremely visible both in Avdiivka and in the Bakhmut, by the way, was to force the Russians to relieve the pressure on multiple fronts, as they are doing for now over a year, and to focus on one front, which would then help the Ukrainians focus their own defenses and get back to these situations we had with Bakhmut, where the main core, the main resistance core on the Ukrainian side was Bakhmut and the area, and it lasted, as you remember, from roughly January, when Solidar fell, up to the 20th of May, when finally Bakhmut was liberated and became Artemovsk again. Now, this situation is exactly what I think Sirski is doing. Sirski is literally doing his old classics, which is try and when you think you're gonna, curl the other side on a defensive position or offensive position when it is going to be way too limited to affect you as deep as it would do by hitting you in multiple places, when basically could inflict you a death by 1,000 cuts. Here, as I said, you focalize him around the area of Pokrovsk, and then you, on both sides, engage into this battle of attrition, where normally the side who should prevail in this case should be the Ukrainian forces. Normally, because this is how Ukrainians think. In reality, the problem is, and I described this on the same space, is that the Russians chose a very basic salami tactic around the area of Pokrovsk, but they complemented it by the complete annihilation of the defensive system south of Donetsk. The Ugledar area that went up to Velika Novosilka, which is probably lost right now, was the cherry to the cake for the Russians. But strategically, it was the target since the beginning, forcing the Ukrainians to try and defend Pokrovsk, lowering their guard and their readiness around that area, pushing towards Novosilka, completely erasing whatever gains the Ukrainians had during the counter, and then, knocking at the door from the side of the defensive lines that go from Velika towards Zaporozhye city. And then we had the Ugledar wall, which, as I said, both renders impossible an attack from the flank, west to east, but by raising it up, also makes it extremely difficult for the Ukrainian artillery to be positioned the way it was before, therefore allows the Russians to advance without risking a major, suppressing and support fire from the Ukrainian side. This, of course, was going to be complemented by the Ukrainians not having the right amount of propellant charges and the good type of ammunition, which forced them to land most of their 30 plus kilometer barrels, 52 calibers or even 39 when it comes to the old Paladins, up to 10 kilometers from front line, making them vulnerable to probably anything that can be thrown at them. FPVs, Lancets, trash like Privet 82, Russian counter battery. Well, you name it. If you stay within those 10 kilometers, you're Ukrainian, and you try to, suppress via artillery Russian assaults, you're going to get killed. And that's what happened. That's why when you look at the fundamental changes of the Donetsk Oblast map, it's the south that went away. Of course, this had also another byproduct, which I also spoke in conjunction with the team, which is, given that Ukrainians started the Kursk bullshit, whereas both sides were allegedly talking about reducing the strikes into the energy sector and fuel sector when it comes to Russia, and energy sector when it came to Ukraine. Well, the Ukrainians simply used that to prepare and see how much it would hurt the Russians, and they enacted the Kursk option. By doing that, as I said, they recognized that Donetsk in a way or another was lost or not defensible as it stood without any kind of external input, and that external input was supposed to be the diversion of troops from the Donetsk area to the Kursk area in order to defeat the Ukrainians definitely there. Now, that option didn't work, and in return, the Russians literally adopted something that Timur Criminal had said for over a year, which is, if the Ukrainians do not understand that it's time to make a deal, even though it's not good for them, but it's better to have a deal than to have dead people, the Russians are going to push into any kind of direction they see fit in order to force them to stop fighting or come and sit at the table. We had identified two options, but the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast was the most important already from the beginning because it would allow the Russians to take over Zaporozhye. However, my idea was taking Pokrovsk, going north to the boundaries of the Kharkov Oblast. It was easier because then you had this triangle of three different oblasts, and you could choose. If it got too hard in Kharkov, southern Kharkov, you could just take the turn, go to Dnipro. Now, there was another point as well, and this is something that's happening right now, which is, in September, I also spoke about the fact that there was an attempted deal or negotiation between Rinat Akhmetov, the owner of Metinvest, and basically the guy who owns most of the Pokrovsk basin from Pokrovsk to Dobropila, for the Russians not to blow up his shit, and once taken over, to respect his right to property. Well, as we speak, there are geolocated Russians in the Pokrovska number 2 mine, which means that the biggest coal mine in Ukraine is currently no longer in Ukrainian possession. This is not some kind of huge victory. I don't give a fuck about that. No, the point is to once again explain that the discussion that was probably held, and it was true, given the development right now, between Monkey's representative and Rinat's representative, where you leave these guys go, you keep as much of your workforce within your business so there are no recruits for the Ukrainian side, or we will just take over your shit and probably dispossess you and burn and just destroy it. Now, thank God, the Ukrainians are doing it themselves. There were footage of alleged destruction of at least one of the two shafts on the Pokrovka 2. And well, at the end, be that the Russians or the Ukrainians, it would not matter, because one of the main cores of the argument when it comes to Russia versus Ukraine, both in metallurgy and coal and ore, is that Russia just wants to take out a competitor. It has nothing to do. Russia doesn't really want the coal from Ukraine as it stands. The point was to get rid of a competitor, and that's it. By doing so, you destroy one source of supply, and therefore make your own supply or someone else's supply, wink wink Australia, wink wink China, whatever, more competitive, because now you have less sources for a bigger cake. So when it comes to why this shadow counter and why we are seeing a shadow counter, well, basically it's simple. We are seeing a raise in loss of assets, while at the same time they are not doing anything to stop the Russians from advancing, although the advance seems to have stopped from the pace it had from November, December to now January. We are roughly around 9 to 10 kilometers a day proven, because that's the funny thing. Don't forget, all this proven stuff is days behind. For instance, when the area around Ugledar, its flank up to Zolotaniva was lost, that stuff happened on the map in mere days, in 3 days exactly. But the reality, and Andrew the pedo came up and started crying about it, was that for a whole month the Russians had been completely flattening the defensive positions with cabs, with FPVs, with tank fire and so on, and they just moved on, pushed the Ukrainians, sent them running, and then they took Ugledar. So the working principle for most of these advances that you are seeing 10, 9, 11, 12 square kilometers a day, in reality, I think we should literally think about 20 square kilometers a day, and including also the gray zones on the Russian side. The gray zone always profits the advancing side in this war, and that's been a tenet both for the Russians early 2022, for the Ukrainians mid 22 and end of 22, and then for both sides 23 and 24. The moment you lose control, the moment you need to fight for everything, you roll the dice. At the same time, we are seeing that some developments, especially up in the Dvorizhny area, so around the Kupiansk area, have completely changed of scale. It's still very small though, but then you start understanding that the counter, while in Pokrovsk, has to do with a strategic industry area and also a threat to another oblast. There you have a dangerous precedent, a dangerous development, which risks condemning and rolling back a good bunch of the advances that you had since September 2022. When you check a map, see where they're going, they are, I think, about 10 to 12 kilometers from Liman. If Liman falls, there are not many ways in the area. It's actually, that's the funny part. There, the whole point to defend yourself would be, unlike Terni, unlike Kupiansk, unlike all that area which still has a very decent and strong force, then you'll need to fucking roll back and probably end up do exactly what the Russians did in 2022, end up in Izium. I'm not saying it's going to be, right away. I'm saying just what the Ukrainians are seeing and why you have this sudden booming of losses, which means a booming of assets employed. And that's also why the Ukrainians now have a problem with infantry. On one side, they are employing these tanks, these fire support methods, these vehicles. On the other side, they are having a huge problem to actually support these advances with infantry, while at the same time defending where they're supposed to defend with, you get it, infantry. So we get back to what we said last year, September, October, which is that the Kursk adventure forced them to burn the candle on both sides. But now with the Kursk adventure still not over, but failing, and the defensive line more or less in central Donetsk and southern Donetsk failing as well, now instead of having only two fronts to fill up and maybe start a counter, a nominal one, an announced one with actual results, they are now having to man defensive positions, offensive positions, actual pushes, on top of being overly represented in Kursk. And the result on the Russian side, especially on Pokrovsk, you can see it, is they are slowly building a kind of vacuum around Pokrovsk, where multiple supply roads are gone. The southwestern supply road is gone, the highway. The northern supply road is under fire from FPVs and shit. Of course, the transition road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka has been now physically cut, finally, at the exchanger northwest of Vozhizhenka, as we said. And all the conditions that we spoke so loudly about between June and September 2004 are there. They only are a bit late when it comes to the transition, the transfer road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. But everything else is there. And on a certain sense, the situation you are seeing in Donbass right now also renders Chasiv Yar absolutely useless for the Ukrainian side. They can keep defending there, but their major problem is that now the Russians are physically on the goddamn highway, which can afford them a sudden push of 5 to 10 kilometers on Konstantinovka southwestern flank. Of course, there are going to be losses. Of course, it needs to be well planned and so forth. But suddenly, you are defending your but you are getting your asses kicked, and that's it. So the point at this current situation is, what do we do? And of course, Sirski comes out and say, hey, the Russians have lost over 400,000 people, and we have stopped their advances. And you heard this shit in Kursk in August. You heard this shit in November by Zelensky, and we're hearing against this shit, and we are at the end of January already. So, the main problem, I'm going to repeat what we say, the main problem on the Ukrainian side seems that they know where they are. They know they have huge problems, but they cannot let go. In that sense, the Russians did the same in 2022. On top of it, this counter is noticeably being quote-unquote bailed out by the strikes, especially on fuel depot, strategic fuel depot. Recently, they claim to have hit the pole floor from the Gorbunov aircraft plant factory. They've attacked Borisovlebsk, Kazan airfield. We still don't know how much damage. We'll probably know it fast enough if there is big damage, because they're the first to show it. And they are going on with these fuel and oil infrastructure damages because the logic is we are going to make Russia earn less money. Less money means less available means. However, as we had the discussion, the Ukrainians were very proud to have stopped Russia for exporting 10% oil versus 2023. However, the profitability of the Russian exports, despite the reduction in physical outflow, was 3.2% higher than 2023, which actually is not good or bad because 2023 wasn't such a wonderful year. But if you're exporting less but earning more, it means that your campaign has obviously failed because you got a differential of 12 to 15% of profitability going up versus the oil that they're not selling. And this is the problem I'm having with Ukrainians. You tried it once, maybe it's going to be better this time. Who knows? Maybe you're going to finally manage to swamp the Russian air defense with your flying trash, and maybe the losses in oil exports going to go from 10% to 20%, and maybe indeed the Russians are going to earn less money. The problem, though, is that it's not right away. It's not, okay, we hit now and suddenly, right away, 24 hours later, Russia is losing 20% of its revenue. Quite the contrary. It's going to be incremental. And meanwhile, the clock is motherfucking ticking for you. And you keep losing. Today, for instance, we have found the footage of 2 more tanks being lost. Different fronts, still 2 more tanks. And then you start making your own calculus. Okay, what was announced, what is being lost, and if it keeps going like this on the eastern type of tanks, they can keep going like this without depletion of their forces for another 2.5 months. But that would mean that in 2.5 months, every unit that's using a Soviet kind of tank, let it be T-62, 64, 72, 80 BV, is going to be bingo. Means like they're going to be down to a company worth of tanks on their brigades. On top of the fact they have issues with maintenance, they have issues also with crews, because that's the thing that's going to happen. If you are seeing what's going on most of the time with the FPVs, especially against the Western tanks, those things, they sometimes take out the whole tank. We're thinking of Zala against the Challenger 2, but most of the time they immobilize, they render the tank useless, and force the crew to leave the tank, allowing whoever is on the other side to hunt the crew down. Grenades, hate drops, whatever. And this is, in a certain sense, the worst part of this. The war is being fought right now, is that you are depriving your armored troops of their armor, and you are completely at the mercy of the other side. And it's true for both sides. I'm not trying to dissociate here, but by doing so, as I said, you're going to start losing crews. You're going to start losing guys, and it doesn't matter if you're losing 1 out of 3, 2 out of 4. 3 out of 4, 2 out of 3. The attrition you're going to have is going to just push back in terms of training and completion of your forces. And suddenly, as I said, it doesn't matter that you still have 100 tanks. You will need to start cobbling together another bunch of guys to make the tank crews. And this will impact the qualification and the quality of your tank driver. Every Ukrainian out there is still laughing about the Russian conscript with 12 weeks of training. But for fact's sake, currently the Ukrainians have less than 4 weeks mostly managing heavy machinery. And this is not due to the fact that the losses per se are so huge. It's due to the fact that once the units are depleted, and this is what we're seeing, you grab whatever you can, and you put them with a gun within their hands, and they push them either to man defensive lines, either to get on the back of a pickup and start attacking a Russian position. This is the same thing on both sides. The current leitmotif for this war is advance, hold, and deplete. Try the other side. There is no magical thinking on the Ukrainian side. Their use of drones, and I've posted multiple complaints by the Ukrainians themselves, the use of drones is hiding a lack of personnel. And the drones themselves, because of the logistical footprint, but also other issues, for instance, they're not fast enough. Like you're not firing an artillery shell to stop the Russians from breaking through your iron ring of drones. You are sending the same kind of shitty drones that flies between 90 and 110 kilometers to go and find the Russians. But by the time they arrive, as I said, especially if the Russians are already on the trench is gone. It has been cleared. And in best case scenario, there are hostages, POWs. In worst case scenario, the Russians are basically doing what we've seen them doing recently, which is kind of hack and slash on Ukrainians. So this is the thing that we are seeing on both sides, actually. A lot of smart guys are understanding the limits of the FPV. Yet it's a very potent weapon, but it's not a strategic game changer. It's a very, very accurate weapon when the electrical warfare is not there and when the equipment you're targeting is not well protected. But once again, once you start looking at the footage, you're going to see 3, 4, 5, 6 FPVs now for some trash cans, Russian or Ukrainian. Some M113s take 2, 3 FPVs. Of course, the crew inside is completely fried. We had a couple of demonstrations like this. And on the other side, the equipment is not completely fucked. The most recent strike by the 47th, I think, of a Russian BTR-82, which started a sympathetic detonation of the ammunition and then the automatic fire of it through the main barrel. Well, it didn't burn the BTR. What it did is probably damage the battery and the breech of the gun, use the ammunition, but the automotive part of the BTR is still there. That thing can still be moved. When? That's something else, of course. But if you guys have followed Gelsio and Narcio on Pokrovsk recently, the latest losses that he found out were 53 to 90 something, or 57 to 93 against the Ukrainians. And one thing he pointed out, in small print of course, is that, given the geolocation of about 60 vehicles were not visible anymore, that means that the Russians had pulled those 60 vehicles out, he just deducted it from the losses. But this is something we already spoke about it. This is how the Russians, in a certain sense, are keeping the ball rolling. And this is where the Ukrainians are having definitive losses so far, because they are not pushing the Russians back. Now, the other problem with this ghost counter is that we most probably will not see it being accepted as such, although Syrskyi very recently said that you cannot win a war simply by defending. There he's already announcing that we are trying to do something. Of course, he had in mind some kind of robotic force, so using FPVs and shit, but the reality is that Syrskyi is trying very hard to unwound himself out of the situation he literally landed himself in by not, pointing out that finally the Kursk operation wasn't his idea. That the Kursk operation was a requisition from Zelensky and Yermak, and then he goes out and says, 3 to 4 officers planned Kursk. And I'm like, why do you lie? Why do the Ukrainians lie like this? Why are you forced to lie like that? You used at least 30 subunits, which meant that the commanding officers of the main units, so divisions, regiments, battalions, whatever, would have to be, briefed at least 2 weeks before. But only 3 to 4 guys plan that shit. And you're like, it's not possible to discuss planning, while at the same time, you got situations like the 93rd, who went to relieve the 155, and which had 8 guys for a battalion, most probably a company, Butuzov exaggerated himself. But that's the whole point we're having here. The problem with the ghost counter is like, if it doesn't work, and it doesn't seem to work so far, as intended, which is subbing the Russian forces, forcing them to say, okay, we're going to let go of Kupiansk for the moment, we're just going to start defending over there. This is what happened in 2023, guys. The Russians tried a creeping offensive up in Kupiansk that landed them not far from Petropavlivka, and then they were slowly pushed back, and then they were locked there 6 kilometers from Kupiansk for ages, Same thing, they did a rush in Kupiansk, advanced very fast, they even entered the city, but since then they haven't moved very much there. They chose another way, of course. And I think this is what Ukrainians want right now. They want a breather, and I discussed this multiple times. Their biggest issue is that the Russians maintain the possibility to pressure them in so many positions that it's simply exhausting just to organize the defenses there. And with the apparent loss of Velika Novosibirsk today, tomorrow, or it's already gone, now you have a huge problem, because Velika Novosibirsk allows the Russians to think Dnipropetrovsk Oblast right away, and also puts in jeopardy all your attempts to actually shield Pokrovsk from this movement. Because suddenly, as I said, we are already at the highway in the southwestern part of Pokrovsk. If those guys go up and erect a kind of wall again on the western side of Pokrovsk, then you're going to end up with the same kind of situation, of course, on a wider range as with Velika. And instead of defending Pokrovsk, you're going to start defending the pincer movement on the western side. And the deeper it goes, the farther you are from your defense line. It's just a screen. And by the time you fought that screen off, guys are already Pokrovsk and it's gone. And then everything you did, all your counter, everywhere along the line, was for nothing. And so far it seems that it is for nothing. Especially the counterattacks around Zelenivka, which were actually noticed 3-4 days ago and only now corrected by Deep State. We are looking at a tremendous loss of life on the Ukrainian side and a tremendous wastage of troops as it stands. Because for once in the current Russian offensive, the Russians are not looking for the Ukrainians anymore. That was the biggest trouble on the Russian side. Having to non-stop score, having to non-stop recon, having to non-stop try and penetrate behind the Russian lines, the Ukrainian lines, cut through them, do the whole finger, hand, fist analogy, and that costed them equipment, people, treasure. But now it's different. Now Ukrainians pop out to try and block you and defend against you. And you have everything ready for them. Optifiber, normal FPVs, artillery, other tanks. We all saw the scene with the 4 Russian tanks blasting away 2 Ukrainian tanks on the same tree line. And this is where the whole idea of the counter both makes sense, because you need that political, breather. You need the Russians not to be able to capture Pokrovsk before, quote-unquote, Trump is inaugurated. But you also need the Russians not to take over Pokrovsk and have the whole spring to prepare the next move. What you want them is basically what happened with Bahmud, Artemov in 2023. You want them to just spend as many people in there, tire themselves, and then you may try some kind of counter. Of course, in the current battlefield transparency, in the current battlefield reality, I do not believe that any kind of Ukrainian counter is going to be very successful within the areas of advance of the Russian military. Therefore, the danger, as for Kursk, would be a wild card, probably once again in Russian territory. As I said, I do not like a couple of strikes that we've seen in Bryansk, and I also do not like the fact that the Ukrainians now suddenly are decided to lose even more people despite their very bad situation. As I said, on one side you think, okay, they are suicidal, and this is the end. They're trying the hardest as possible to freeze the lines and then start some kind of negotiations. But on the other side, if you're a little bit paranoidal, you're like, oh, why? The fact they're losing so many assets, they're still getting beaten back, but they're not stopping. What is that? We don't know. What is that they are expecting that we don't know? And in a certain sense, employing equipment and bodies because we're awaiting more bodies and who knows more equipment might be a bluff on the Ukrainian side to just put the Russians on the back foot, at least mentally. The problem, however, when you go there, is that the Russians themselves do not seem to care. Once Pokrov started to quote-unquote stall, especially around the Promin in Moskovsk and in Mirnograd, because they were literally 1.1 kilometer away. They could literally do a rush, occupy positions there, and start the quote-unquote battle. But they're not doing it, and as you're seeing, they are widening up the front, stretching the defensive lines, trying to completely cut them from the west, and it's logical, and it's something we spoke about. We spoke about the fact that the first thing they needed to do is to just not allow the Ukrainians to have a undisputed defense line, which would allow them to, maneuver around the advancing Russian forces. By having these fingers go forward and cut small pockets of Ukrainian defenders, then slowly, they either would go back, therefore avoid a battery, or they're going to try and defend themselves, and it would be a irremediable loss on their behalf. And this is what has been going on for now 3 months. And this makes completely sense, and it's a good investment on the Russian side, and a bad one on the Ukrainian side. However, the fact they're not changing their tune, and I know that Timur Criminal thinks that the Ukrainian leadership, military leadership, are a bunch of retards, and unfortunately they are. However, they do not always have a choice. I mean, they're not fighting the Taliban here, they're fighting Russia. Therefore, there is this retarded but not too retarded card for them. But here, the double guessing is pretty easy. It's the one or the other. Either it's the end, and they're trying to have Trump, play savior, or there is something that we don't know, and the whole mobilization phase is just going to prolong the war for at least 6 more months. Now, you all have also seen the article from a former Party of the People deputy, which is now a deputy for another faction at the Rada, who said that the military realistically would like to finish this war, of course, with a, let's say, draw, as he said on the live footage, by the end of June, so at the mid-year. Mostly because the losses are going to start piling up, And once again, what is more or less visible, but once again, you do not have to believe the Ukrainians, is that the kind of losses that is required from the Ukrainians right now, given their position and given the general situation at every level, artillery, ammunition, tanks, vehicles, and also the troop readiness on the Ukrainian side, does not allow them any kind of prospect in 2026. I'm not saying that Ukraine is going to disappear like Patrushev. No, quite the contrary. I'm saying that right now, you are not seeing the results, at least the Ukrainians are not seeing the results of this ghost counter. Russians keep advancing. You start to lose as many assets as the Russians in some places. And the losses in personnel are also huge. So what's going on and what do you need to do? The moment it will down to whoever there that this counter is a disaster, then we'll see probably a third flip over, probably more damage and devastation on the Russian side, because this is one of the Ukrainian things right now. Because they are basically covered and held by Western ISR and US targeting and US intelligence, they still have that card. They're still gonna send 200, 300, 400 flying trash drones on your general direction, and you're gonna maybe stop half of them, maybe 75%, but it's still a huge number of drones, especially because they do not even need to eradicate your refinery. What they need to is arrive to a point when your fracking tower, when your general pump, or where your oil farm just goes up. And then it's up to you to battle 3, 4, 5 days to extinguish it. And that's it, On a PR side, it's huge. On a aggregated side, it's also huge because they're going to just keep doing it. And the only way to counterattack this, is to take out the people who are allowing this and who are making this possible. Unfortunately, unless eradicating 10% of Ukrainian population, this is not possible. And in the worst case scenario, when you would be able to reach those people who are manufacturing, assembling all the shit, they're just going to move abroad. We already have seen equipment manufactured in the US and just assembled in the Ukrainian western part. Doesn't really matter. Like, a worst case scenario, they're going to set up shop in Poland. And it's going to be a good investment even. And you're going to have all this flying trash going up and up and up and up and up. And the only solution on the Russian side, as I said, is to be paying the Ukrainians both in lives. So you probably all have seen the strikes in Zaporozhye with cruise missiles. So, yeah, you're going to kill 50, 100 guys off the bat. It's sad, but this is the game now. It's counter value, it's reprisals. And on the other side, energy-wise, okay, you're going to reduce it. No, you're going to force them to start damaging their internal economy, which is what we saw for 2024. Ukrainians were supposed to be growing at 5%, it was only 2.7%. I even think it's less. And it comes after the biggest chunk of money that Ukrainians got in 2024. I'm not speaking about weapons, I'm just speaking about financial aid. So, you got them. Losing the whole Pokrovsk basin with probably 2 to 3 months, is going to cause a bigger disruption than actually bombing all the factories that are building trash weapons for the Ukrainians. strangling the Ukrainian state out of funds, but also out of raw material and out of transit alleys. So basically, if you cut the E15 over there and are strong enough to go to Mezhove, which is west of Pokrovsk, you're going to kill a whole nodule of railroad within the now occupied Ukrainian territory, within Dnipropetrovsk. You cannot imagine how bad that would be for the internal transit. And as I said, if you go up and you take Dobropila, then you force the Ukrainians to use the rail all over the northern part of the country in order to reinforce Kharkov and still keep up the sister cities alive. So militarily speaking, we are 20 kilometers on one side and maybe 16 on the other of creating the perfect disaster for the military aspect of this conflict. All that while also putting more pressure in specific sections of the railroad on the Ukrainian side, which then, of course, you've understood, once they are getting a lot more traffic, when you get grants to visit them, or Iskander, or whatever. So the strangulation tactics and strategy thought by the Russians right now, in some weird way, are being helped out by this ghost content. And in a certain sense, I hate conspiracy theories, guys. And in this case, I'm a bit afraid of pulling the trigger, but I'm going to say, it seems like Syrskyi is accelerating this madness in order for either Zelensky to pull him out and take out the burden of his war from him, or he's Nashslon and he's making everything possible to put Ukraine in such a edge of the abyss that ultimately it wouldn't matter what stuff is being given to the Ukrainians once, as I said, once Mezhove is cut and once the Russians are in Dobropila, you're going to have a now western wall next to the sister cities, with the danger, as I said, to go, Safonovka up north and then go straight up to the Kharkov southern border. And then you have a whole other shit show. Because the scare that would be gripping the Ukrainian leadership if you're up there is that you're going to lose the whole coal and ore basin in Donbass, but then you're also going to have access to where you never were able to put a feet, which is southern Kharkov, which links you up with the rest of Dnipropetrovsk and cuts through and goes towards Poltava. This is the biggest fucking fear that the Ukrainians should have right now. But they do not seem ready to face it, although when you see a lot of mappers, you see that they are building trenches on that area. But it's still nowhere near what they're supposed to be defending. And also another problem with the counter that we're seeing, of course it still needs to be acknowledged, is that it's so piecemeal, and of course this is due to the fact that they are low on men and maybe a bit on equipment. It's so piecemeal that it seems unreal. It looks a lot like the Russian last days of the Lysychansk-Severodonetsk campaign. And at that point, you could feel the exhaustion of a lot of troops that had reached the limits of the Luganda Oblast. But this time it's the Ukrainians. Use one tank here, one tank there, one tank there. It makes it easier for the Russians to just wipe them out. And then you're going to use a bit more equipment in Kursk. It's also going to get wiped out. So we are into this logic of what is Syrskyi doing? And if it's not Syrskyi, who the fuck is managing this war? And trust me, there are enough troubles on the Russian side. This has nothing to do with, everything is rosy on the Russian side. But right now it works for the Russians, and it's being enhanced by the, in my opinion, lack of skill or lack of sense on the Ukrainian leadership so far. The whole unknown right now is what's going to happen with Trump. Is the alleged peace plan that was hinted by a couple of guys, you remember, we freeze the lines where they are. We do not directly recognize the four oblasts, but we restrain the Ukrainians for doing anything, and then we had discussed the lines. You give up part of your CBR funds, but we're going to recognize specific areas where you will have something in return. So basically, no NATO, no NATO equipment to threaten the balance of force in the area, which, of course, as I said, is completely bullshit. That's the first thing that's going to fly out of the window. Remember that one part of the decision for Putin to go to war was when the Ukrainians started to use TB2s to strike LNR, DNR positions. Clearly, there was a Pavlovian reaction to what we saw in Syria and what we saw in Artsakh. But generally speaking, a lot of the stuff that Trump is said to have been presented to Russia's envoys doesn't make it feel like Trump's going to manage that quick ceasefire/peace. Quite the contrary. What is obvious, especially with what the Ukrainians are doing here, is that the Ukrainians are going to have a huge deficit if whatever attempt on the Ukrainian side, we're speaking peace attempt here, fails, and whatever Trump proposes and the Russians smell the problem, well, as I said, wasting a lot of shit right now, not having any kind of result, and hoping that Trump is going to manage the Hail Mary, but that Hail Mary is either stripped from Trump or get intercepted, well, I think then we're going back to fourth and long, and knowing Trump, we are going to look at an escalation. Escalation would mean that Ukrainians are going to start forgetting about Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and probably about Kharkov Oblast. And we're going to have exactly what Trump managed to fuck up in 2017, 2019 in Afghanistan, when he started very gung-ho to defeat the Taliban, but within a year and a half, he sent people to Doha to have a discussion about getting the fuck out of there. So, my big issue with this counter is that what he's doing is killing off, by being useless, the chances of a Ukrainian favorable ceasefire, and is raising the tax for any kind of ceasefires on both sides. If Trump loses face in negotiations because Ukrainians are not strong enough to assert their position on the ground, the risk is that the Ukrainians are going to, end up into a tailspin towards hell. And once again, it's their doing. It's not Trump's. Trump thought, okay, these guys are tired and stuff like that, then these idiots start this shadow counter in order to, defend their positions. These positions do not work. Look, they lost Velika, Toretsk is gone, they're going to lose Chasik. And within, the German elections, in a month, who knows? Russians are in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and probably Kursk is even further halved. So it's irrelevant. How do you think Monkey is going to go to Trump and say, you know what, bro, I'm winning, but I'm going to take the L for you because, I'm Monkey, you're Orange Rutan, apes together strong. Of course it's not going to work. And no matter how much Monkey wants to cock here, it's just not going to fly. Nobody's going to give the cocaine addict a W where he is literally handing his ass to get fucked for about 3 months now. Of course, even before, but for 3 months right now, given the losses and given how the Russians are advanced in November, December, and January, and the screams, the croaks, and the squeals from the piggers, you can understand they've lost the sense of battle within Donbass, southern and central. They're still keeping strong at the Kharkov northern Donbass line and the bits of Lugansk that the Russians haven't recovered yet. But that's it, and it's mostly due to the topography, which in due time is also going to fall. So, to close up this look at the potential or the ghost counter that we're seeing, given the losses and given the posture that more and more Ukrainian units are taking over. It seems to me that the Ukrainians, like usual, are falling for their own con, which is we need to hold on until Trump is inaugurated and everything's going to be fine because Trump is going to force the Russians to actually capitulate. The problem, as I already explained with that, is that what if it becomes an own goal? It becomes an interception with a return 7 points. What if? And it looks like that right now. Then how are you going to convince the baboons at the Stavka that, you know what, we're going to just get this shit done and we're going to take the L instead of getting all the oblasts, and we're going to accept that a hub like Pokrovsk is not taken before the ceasefire. This is not going to work. It makes no sense unless Monkey is given something that would be even worse than NATO losing, which is a recognition of the territorial losses, even at the line, as Russian. Because everybody's discussing this right now, like, oh, we are going to probably send peacekeepers after the ceasefire. There is no ceasefire in view. So, what's going on? Well, as I said, it really seems that the Ukrainians have fallen for their own con, which is Trump's going to save them. And I really think that a lot of stuff is going to go extremely awry, given how the Russians are seeing the situation right now, especially with how the Ukrainians are using every possible stuff and play in the shithead playbook, of which the Azeris fell victim this time. So I really do not think that the Ukrainians have much choice in doing what they're doing, but it's going to backfire on them in such terms that initially it might even look like Trump is throwing them under the bus. But in fact, what Trump is going to see quickly enough, especially if he's briefed properly by the Ukrainians, so basically it's shown the true nature of losses, which I assure you, I'm not going to wade over right now, but this year has been absolutely apocalyptical for Ukraine. And we're not going to add the deserters, Just gonna tell you, killed and missing in action is a fuck ton of people. And we are expecting the scandal to pop out. The moment that scandal is out there and the numbers are out there, I really think that a lot of NAFWIDs that are adamant that nothing is happening and then the shortage is due to this and that are going to wake up. And of course, we're going to hear about genocide and shit, but trust me, things are going to look a lot less rosy. And so basically, if Trump is given a proper briefing of both the capacity and the actual losses on the Ukrainian side, I think the Ukrainians are going to have a small respite because Trump is going to say, okay, these guys are getting fucking murdered. So he's going to start being a little bit tougher on the Russians and making threats. But generally speaking, he's not going to help out the Ukrainians make their position on the table better right away. He is more than probably going to let them continue with the shitty campaign at hitting Russian infrastructure. But the biggest problem with that will be that the Russians are probably going to reply by killing actual civilians. And as I said, it's not going to be some kind of, ancillary targeting. It's going to be full on. We had epicenter last year. Well, think about 10 epicenters. And the funny part is that the Ukrainians are using all kind of civilian storage units for their own military needs. So it wouldn't even be a problem to make it look like, for at least when it comes to the people that matter actually, make it look like it wasn't even a civilian target. So basically, right now, biggest issue for the Ukrainians is to find out what they want with their counter. The second issue is, what if it doesn't work? And the third issue is, if it doesn't work, but it's priced in, therefore, as I said, what if it's Sirski is just trying to get fired, or is just trying to end the war by throwing everything he has, failing, because he knows he's going to fail, more or less, and then having Ukraine on that abyss, where the only choice would be exactly what retards like Tatagemi were asking for, which is mobilization. You ask for mobilization among Ukrainians, you kill that economy, the whole country goes into a tailspin of nonsense, and you just end up, and I did a thread for that, just end up with a lot of dead Ukrainians and Russians, but dead Ukrainians, which completely kill any kind of peace deal. Like, if 500,000 Ukrainians join back, go to war, have some success but have exponential losses, and the Russians mobilize, get on the Ukrainian tails, end up taking another oblast, there is nothing else to do but for NATO or the US or whoever to just intervene and open the Pandora box. So this ghost counteroffensive is so much trouble, has so much disruptive potential to the kind of quote-unquote happy ending the Ziegler sphere wants. It will not change the outcome, generally speaking. It will just make it absolutely unfathomable for the next 15 to 20 years when it comes to the polity of Ukraine and, of course, the polity of Russia. And also would probably have a direct impact on how China sees its trajectory versus the US and Western forces, generally speaking. Not militarily, I'm just saying how the Chinese vision for the future, 15, 20 years, is going to be with, let's say, the US taking at least a advisory role for the Ukrainian forces, a bit like what they started in 61, 62 in Vietnam. It's like some kind of intervention, like be that them or the Europeans. Just to finish off this, the most important part right now is for the Ukrainians to lose the whole Pokrovsk Basin. And this counter makes it better in long term for the Russians, makes it a better prospect. My only scare is that Zelensky seeing that within 2 months he's going to lose Pokrovsk and the whole basin, and also so basically 5 to 6% of his GDP right away, might very well start, notify Trump that he's ready to tap out. And that would be, I think, the worst part, because it will be like, the last ditch attempt, you fail, and then because you have those people behind you, you're going to start asking for a tap out. And that could also be a problematic decision, because let's say that Zelensky indicates he wants to tap out, but he will only accept the quote-unquote battlefield realities, so he doesn't want to give up, let's say, the whole of Zaporozhye, because as you know, I told you, it would mean Zaporozhye city and a whole crossing, so 4 bridges, 3 actually, but 4 bridges over Dnieper would be gone, plus the approach towards Dnipropetrovsk would be in danger. Clearly, Zelensky is not ready to do that. But recognizing the battlefield realities, if he doesn't do this fast enough, might also mean that the Russians would be somewhere between 500 square kilometers to 2,000, 3,000 square kilometers from Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which, I'm going to repeat, is going to be extremely complicated to pull the Russians out without a counterpart. Let's say you lost your Kursk counterpart, and the Russians have a huge chunk of Dnipropetrovsk, or a small chunk, doesn't matter. What are you going to give them? Neutrality is part of the whole deal, no joining NATO. A smaller army, that's not possible for Ukrainians. Give them the legal boundaries of every oblast. We already discussed this. It's not possible, because that means the Russians are on the other side of the Dnieper on 2 oblasts, in Zaporozhye and in Kherson. And there is a continuous path there. They can cross from Zaporozhye city and they can cross from Kherson city. Literally, that's handing to the Russians Kryvyi Rog and Nikolaev, at least. Not going to happen either. So, if the coke addict doesn't give up fast enough, if the counter is going like this for another 2 or 3 months, there will be nothing else but a mild intervention on the American side to, bring Russia to the table. The problem with that is that Russia will not understand that mild intervention as some kind of joke and fun and accept to give up what it holds. They're going to double down as they've done up until now, because they would feel that America laid the rules of the game, which was proxy war, without us taking on. That's what Biden said. No co-belligerency, no part of the war, although we know that's bullshit for the letter of the law. But if Trump goes beyond that, then that's it. You open the Pandora box. And what happens then? Let's say that he's going to be hit in the face. That it's not going to be the reply from Iran, which had 3 guys have a heart attack in the US. but you have a Iskanderization of at least 3-4 air bases, then what? This is the biggest trouble that I'm having right now with the Ukrainian leadership. They have put in the shit every single pattern they've had for the last 10 to 15 years. Yushchenko was a fucking moron, and he almost had a war. Yanukovych was too weak, forced Russia's hand. Yatsenuk and friends were too stupid, and they didn't manage to understand the threat from Russia. Then you had Poroshenko, which was probably the most Mongoloid of them all, because he started the operation as the president, he promised bullshit, then he lost, went out to say 65% of what we engaged in Donbass was lost, destroyed, which is true actually, and then ended up losing to the comedian who got in by promising peace, but straight up trashing whatever he promised, delivered war to Ukraine, disaster, famine, calamity, and then completely went off the charts. Now Biden's administration is saying like, oh, we never promised this, this, and that, which is a way for them to wash their ass. It's logical. But there is a reality in there. Biden wanted a proxy war long enough to bother Russia to a point where they would not continue the war. They would sit and have the discussion. The problem between the US and Russia in this discussion mode is that because the US cut through the first negotiations with the two parts that are actually those who are warring right now, Russia and Ukraine, for some reason Biden didn't think that the Russians would go to the end of this discussion. And it is true that after what we are hearing from the Biden administration, the Ukrainians are completely entitled to some kind of outrage and some kind of knife in the back logic. However, they're far beyond what they could reproach the Americans, because I'm going to repeat, without America, Ukraine falls in June 2022, at best in March 2023, and there is no discussion about what's going to happen right here. So, your problem is that you can claim that America betrayed you, but you cannot claim that America wanted you to lose. And since probably mid-counter until now, Zelensky is making some decisions that are completely contrary to what the Americans want. Americans gonna be fine with Russia having some refineries burned and stuff like that, but at the same time, they're not fine with Ukraine literally going off rails, going to Kursk, losing a huge chunk of troops and armor, and then ending up with a nuclear option, which is we're losing so much, you need to bail us out. For Biden at least. Trump, that's the fucking maverick, that's the unknown. And this is the big problem in the sense that, as I said, either there is this plan when America Zanami and they're gonna fucking help us out, either there's a huge miscalculation on the Ukrainian side, with, of course, as I said, huge potential repercussions, but that fundamental is not going to change what's going on in Ukraine and who's going to win and who's going to lose. For as long as it stays on this level. Now, if America, for some reason, under Trump, goes full retard, then as I said, guys, I think we are going to suffer in Europe a lot worse than we ever thought we were going to suffer. It's not going to be fuel at benzene or diesel at 2.9 or something. It's us like looking a bit suntanned, let's say it like this. I'm not even sure that it would be hurting Ukraine more than us, because I think it would be a complete civilization pitfall back then. If it goes that far, if we go to that point, doesn't matter if Russia loses. Europe has lost at that point. If we become some kind of ground for a nuclear exchange or even a large-scale warfare between Russia and NATO forces, we're done as a world player. And then Nafwits can laugh about how China's going to gobble Russia. Meanwhile, they're going to gobble us as well. Us being the Europeans, of course. So thank you very much for the space right now. I don't know if you have any kind of, intervention or whatever. But yeah, please, up to you guys. Okay, go on, Kremlin. Yeah, go on, man.
Yeah, so first of all, like officially, Happy New Year, Ziggers. Um, I actually like the last part of the conversation, the point that you're making about actual intervention, because from time to time I would actually bring this sort of stuff up, and it's really interesting. I mean, my guess is that. Yeah, like obviously Ukraine is having some sort of manpower. I still think they will try to do another desperate act, another sort of PR type of thing, right? Separate from Kursk. They're going to burn through a lot of men to just kind of like, hey, we're still in the fight. But after that, I do believe they will be in the situation where they're kind of like outright saying, guys, we're losing. Like, you have to come in and help us. Like, this is basically the story we've seen Ukraine kind of peddle ever since, what was it? Late 2022, early 2023. Basically, they want a NATO intervention. Like, they want to somehow force the hand, right? And that's very interesting. Like, how would this look like? I don't think I honestly, I don't think, and obviously, I'm trying to ask you guys as well, like, kind of like, want an opinion from you guys. I would not see this as a direct NATO intervention as being NATO. It would be something along the lines of a coalition of the willing, this sort of bullshit. Why I see this happening is because, first of all, you do not have the appetite of all these countries to actually go to a war, and this would actually be like, if you would try to force countries within NATO to be like, yeah, let's go to war, I think that would be the worst thing. That would actually be a lot more counterproductive. You'd basically put countries in NATO in the situation where they have to say, you know what, fuck it, I'm out. If you guys really want to go local, I'm out. So I would think they would just try to do a coalition of the willing if they were to go ahead. Like, I'm talking about the specific scenario, because this still gives the sort of like Ukraine-like scenario where there are countries that are supporting you, right? But they're somehow not part of the conflict, right? So you can still have repair shops and this and that in some fucking country, NATO country, but they're not part of the conflict, you know. They're not part of the conflict. No, they're not. And my guess is if there's this coalition of the willing intervention, it's probably going to be something along the lines of UK, French, Poland, and maybe a couple of other small countries. I don't see the US entering because if you look at the United States history, at least recent history, they always show up to the war, to the party late. They only intervene late when, so to speak, the dice have already been rolled, and it's a good hand. Let's put it like that. So that's kind of how I see it. If it's going to be an intervention like this, I don't know. I'm 50-50 on this. I still think there's the possibility of doing something retarded, like we just saw recently. What was it? An article about the French doing some sort of simulation of fighting off the Russians at the Dnieper with 3,000 special forces, some bullshit like that. I'm not saying they're going to win or whatever the fuck. I'm just saying they might send in some troops under their own flag, not this bullshit volunteer crap. But I'm like, really curious what you guys think about this kind of like scenario, how I see it. And also there's an important factor. Like, okay, if you do this shit, like if you have this sort of non-Ukrainian country intervention, it goes both ways. Like, is there going to be a non-Russia country that is aligned with Russia that's going to intervene in a more direct way? Probably. Like, regarding what was the guy, the Chinese guy at the UN said, like, we're not helping Russia. If we were to help Russia, it would be very visible on the battlefield. So I really kind of like, I'm interested in what what do you guys think about that?
Well, the problem is that Zelensky said the first. He had discussions with many of the people who are training, preparing logistics for.
Bro, you're kind of muzzled. You're kind of muzzled. Okay, I think it's better now. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's better now. Go
So
ahead.
Zelensky made it clear he had a discussion with both Brits, Germans, and the French, and the logic was very simple. The Brits do not have the firepower to get there in any kind of other possibility than maybe some infiltration, spec ops, and stuff like that. But that wouldn't be any kind of problem due to the skill of fighting. I mean, the Ukrainians are using spec ops for hit and runs, and they're losing them. As I said, Gur, for instance, up to last year had lost 600 guys. Let's say that you divide that per 2, that's 300. So imagine losing 300 special force operators when you're the UK, out of your 140,000 total military force. It's a huge loss, especially given the role they're going to occupy. On the French side, we already know that the French have a huge problem equipping and maintaining their position in Romania. The whole point when it was presented was that the Romanian deployment for the French would be some kind of pressure point for the Russians when it came to Transnistria. And that thing, despite many people laughing about the idea, is that to this day we are seeing the pressure on Transnistria via, a kind of Moldova calling on Romania to go through and so on and so forth. But for the French to use 3,000 to 5,000 people to cross the Bug, actually, in its biggest choke point through the Zatoka passage, would be retarded. But okay, once again, it's Macron we're talking about. But once again, there's just not the muscle there. So what kind of intervention are we looking at? 20, 25, 30,000 people? The whole Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, was 40,000 people with the 24 foreign brigades, plus the 16, initially 6, and then the 10,000 idiots that the Ukrainians found to get slaughtered and killed and captured for a total gain of about 450 square kilometers. We are going to the same logic now in Kursk, where while the initial push was huge, I don't know if you guys saw the latest Lord Bibo post, and literally it was there showing one lady that said, in Kursk we've lost ground and people, and it doesn't seem to do anything to stop the Russians to Pokrovsk. She was invited on the plateau. So it's just the same. The problem with the intervention part would be a face-saving measure that could backfire extremely, but nobody's going to do that on their own flag without the U.S. going by. And it's true that the U.S. are going to put their feet down once they think they have won. It's logical. But in this case, nobody from France, Germany, or the UK are going to go there without the promise, or at least a pledge from the US that if it goes wrong, let's say you are in your shitty column and try to advance under a false flag, like you disguise your guys as Ukrainians and try to take over a trench system beyond the Dnieper, and your staging area gets Iskander to shit and you lose straight up 200-300 people killed or wounded, plus guys that you have get taken prisoners, and they talk, because that's the funny thing. Unless you're going to employ the whole special force component of France, Germany, UK, and Poland, you'll never have the numbers without, normal military. And those guys, they're going to crack. Those guys, especially if wounded, and especially under duress, and especially under Russian torture, they're going to yap. They're going to talk. Never mind what kind of equipment you're going to seize, the fact that, your whole force that was supposed to be Ukrainian is made of 200 French and 300 Brits. Like, it's not going to work under their own flag unless there is a pledge from America to cover them by any means possible. But if that pledge works, then there is no logic for the Americans not to intervene themselves. You're better served by yourself than try to, outsource this to Ukrainians and French, have a huge backlash, lose, who knows, 10% of that force in the early stages. Let's not forget, Zaporozhye was literally this. Zaporozhye, those guys, the first day got creamed. So what are we talking about? Now, my problem with intervention is that it's going to be ancillary, which means that they are going to have a large rain strike, mostly by Air Force, try and saturate the Russian defenses and cause a pause in whatever movement is there. It's not going to impact right away the fighting on the ground. This is what happened in 2022. From roughly May to July, the strikes, especially in the area of Kharkov, were impacting the Russians, but they never stopped pushing forward until roughly around July, when they literally rolled over and died because they were almost fully depleted. And then in August, you had the attempt in Kherson that failed initially, or at least was contained. And in September, you had the all in all that Syrskyi tried, rushing through depleted areas of the Kharkov grouping and ending up with a huge 8 to 11,000 square kilometers taken in about a month or so. So if that's the play that's going to happen, that's how it's going to start. It is going to be an Air Force intervention initially to try and have the Russians think twice about, we're going to keep hitting you. What you're going to do about that? And the guys that are hitting you, well, you never know. I mean, when you get hit by a storm shadow, everybody says that it's a Su-24, right? Well, if you get hit by another storm shadow or something that looks like a storm shadow, How are you going to know that how are you going to prove that it's not being fired by a F-18, F-15, or a Rafale? And who's going to believe you, even if that's true, especially if it's true? Nobody's believing you when you're saying that, guys, we've taken over this, and that. They're getting their asses handed to them. No, everybody's like, hey, Ukraine is still resisting or winning or whatever. This is the nonsense we're seeing here. So, if we're speaking about intervention, I do not see why the Americans would hide behind the French or the Brits. What they could do is they would hide behind the Ukrainians on the air, but on the ground it makes no sense, simply because this war has proven that losses on both sides on any ground attack are going to be huge. And you cannot hide them. This is why the whole North Korean nonsense with Ukraine is so funny. Like, we might qualify maybe 2 or 3 cases for a alleged contingent of 12,000, bro. Come on now. But if you're gonna have a contingent of 15,000 foreigners, French-speaking, English-speaking, German-speaking, it's gonna be easy. The moment these guys are gonna die, or get wounded, or get captured, they're gonna sink. And we've had that with multiple cases. You have the Australian that allegedly got executed. We had Colombians that got captured that ended up, being killed in action. It's not complicated. So I do not think that there's going to be any kind of mad skills nonsense from the American side. It's going to be simple. They want to intervene. They're going to start an air campaign. First of all, it's going to be mostly a warning shot to see if the Russians are receptive or not. And if the Russians are not receptive, there's going to be a bit bigger. And if the Russians then reply, then you have a problem, because then the Russians basically called your bluff. And once you're there, now your whole logic of shadow intervention changes, because what you're going to do? You're going to, chicken out or double down. If the Russians went there, so they basically hit you back in Zhov or whatever, or Frankfurt am Main, all this stuff, Rammstein. Now it's over. It's clear. We get into a situation between Iran and Israel. Devil is out of the box. It's either you budge, either you don't. And in any case, the moment we have that exchange, I think a lot of people are going to get scared. And then it might very well happen that those who are now on the fence, that, where, okay, for as long as it's a proxy war, is all fine. But now that you stroke first, in this case would be NATO, I do not see why the Chinese would literally stop. The Chinese would do what they do usually, gonna go on the USNC, are gonna denounce the Americans, gonna make their options clear, and then there you have it. You're gonna have the burgeons of the sprouts of World War III. And it's not that the Chinese are going to dare do something extreme, but it's very simple. The moment you change the rules of the proxy war you pushed into Russia, you're going to change the rule of any kind of proxy war you're going to push in any big power. China, Russia, Brazil, anywhere. And then you're back to the very thing that made the Chinese go full loco, which is the century of humiliation. You made rules, we abode by rules, you change the rules because you're losing, fuck this shit. The only big problem here is that Trump makes this believable. Because he's a wild card, because he's a bit of a doofus, this is believable in the Trump administration. And that's the only, actually my only scare right now, is that he goes so far beyond what's acceptable that out of the blue we have a huge exchange And we're fucked. As Europeans, we're fucked. Russians probably as well. But the battleground would be us and our periphery. And that's it. That's it. That's my whole approach into this. Is that the biggest trouble you have right now is that you have a political amateur who has now, he's literally pulling an Albanian 997 with a rug pull with his meme coin and his wife. It's like, you have a fucking Ponzi scheme going on by the president-elect to be inaugurated today. Imagine what this guy can do if he gets fed up militarily. I think everybody should be scared. It's funny because we're powerless. But imagine what a scamster like that can pull both on Ukraine and Russia. So guys, forget about own flag or non-Article 5 intervention. Do you really think that France, who cannot sustain into a mild and non-adversarial ecosystem in Africa, can barely sustain 5,000 guys, they're going to go to Russia or Ukraine and try to sustain 20,000 with the other guy lobbing ballistic missiles, short-range ballistic missiles to your ass? It's completely unbelievable. Unless, as I said, Trump goes full retard. And he's the guy to go full retard. So yeah, that's it mostly.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up on that a little bit because you made a good point, and this is kind of like a similar point that I was also kind of like making last year. If there's any sort of intervention, it's going to be an air campaign because NATO is first and foremost an aviation, if you think about it, right? That's basically the strength, the bread and butter of NATO. All this bullshit forces on the ground. That's basically policing. Like that's basically policing. NATO is basically Air Force, and in case of the United States Navy, the ground forces, Army. Don't get me wrong, they still have a lot of troops and whatnot, but they're not like a ground army. They're not Russia, China, these, you know, historically speaking, ground-based armies. And I still have like one question, because obviously you have a large air campaign. If you try to do this bullshit, then like as you said, either Putin kind of like wants to sit at the table and talk. I don't think that his generals are going to let him do that. So there's going to be a retaliation. And now we're getting into that point. The interesting point is, like, if you're Russia and you want to retaliate against these air forces, like, do you full on go tactical? Or is this like the purpose? Because I still look at the whole fucking Oreshnik thing. Like, people call me crazy for it. But I still think that the main reason that he used it and why they're developing it is to have a non-nuclear alternative to hitting airfields, air bases all across Europe in record time, in a few minutes. I think that's because I don't think they want to go like tactical nukes right off the bat. They want to have something really good that you cannot intercept, that kind of like, you don't know if it's nuclear or conventional, so that's going to put a little bit of a pressure on your ass, fire on your ass, and that can cause a lot of damage to an airbase. So, and I think, honestly, I think that's kind of like the reason. And if that happens, yeah, definitely, we're definitely we're gonna see the not special. That's my thought on this.
Well, the problem is that being conventional or nuclear would matter if you're going to use Oreshnik on Ramstein until it hits. You have no way of knowing what it is in there. Um, and that's the big problem, because the ambiguity of the system makes it almost certain a replica of the same nature. You cannot simply say, "Oh, I fired an Oreshnik, but it's only explosive warheads." It beats the purpose. Your retaliation cannot be, as I said, telegraphed like Iranians said, like, "Oh, we're gonna hit Ain al-Assad with SRBMs," but you can hide. It's just to save face. If the Americans hit you, a bit like Israel with Iran, if the Americans hit multiple points in Crimea, in the new territories, or in Russia, that's a cause for concern, because it's an NPT issue. You got a nuclear force striking strategically a other nuclear force. Any kind of asset you're going to use to hit Russia is going to be 900 kilometers plus. Basically, it's going to be your strategic force, that you want it or not. That's the problem with escalation from the US. That's the main issue. That's why the US has no other tool but to employ strategic forces, or a strategically challenging vector, which would literally open the door for Russia nuking the shit out of everything America and Europe. The whole game that we are seeing here is who blinks first. That's why the Russians used the Oreshnik the way they did, which is basically just inert warheads, to just show, motherfucker, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna nuke this bitch if you don't back off. And of course they didn't. They didn't back off because, once again, for the Americans, Ukrainians' lives are cheap. What they did, they just admonished a little bit Zelensky behind the ears, and then it was, let's do another rail of coke with Hunter. Literally. And then we had this whole escalation, which is now, we're in January, and we have the same bullshit they started last January 2014. And once again, it doesn't matter how much the Russians are going to kill Ukrainians. What will matter is where they're going to kill them. So, offing some people in Zapo makes no sense. The point is making specific cities uninhabitable. But in the case of NATO intervention, your biggest problem is not that it's going to be a game changer right away. As I said, my biggest issue is that the Americans are going to half-ass it. And you're going to end up with the exact reverse situation with the Russians. Putin used Oreshnik, everybody's like, oh my god, and then we completely forgot about that. Oh, who the fuck cares about Oreshnik? Same for America. If it's just some kind of, oh, beware, we're going to do something more, then what? The Russians are going to fully reply on Ukraine, cause a wanton violence of rarely met level, and then the Americans are going to be forced to do what? Double down? If it was a warning shot, the Americans are going to be faced with the same dilemma as the Russians were. If you poke the bear enough, the bear is going to fucking claw you. Same thing for the eagle. Both sides in this war, both big guys in this war, they're locked into this unsolvable riddle, which is, if one of them threatens the other strategically, we're not saying via proxy, I'm saying strategically, you are going to get smacked back. And then you start the vicious circle, which leads to probably a scorched earth policy over much of the European military and civil installations. We just don't want that. And the Americans, what they want Russia to win or lose, but they want an end of this thing, because at the end, it's then when you're going to make all your accounts. Like, if the Russians win the way they want to win, then they're not going to receive the $300 billion back after, 20, 30 years. If the Russians accept the deal, maybe, as I said, they're going to receive part of it, but another part is going to be reinvested to rebuild Ukraine, because they would receive a bunch of new oblasts. If Russia, quote unquote, loses or doesn't win the way it should be winning, so basically what it earns is just Crimea being recognized and no Crimean land bridge, stuff like that, which would be an absolute fiasco, then you have another view of this war. But for America, what they want, and this is what Biden is communicating, or at least the Biden administration is communicating right now, they wanted Russia to be in a pit and get out of that pit. And how much would it cost it? A kind of soul movie. You're going to cut your leg, you're going to cut your hand, you're going to poke out an eye, stuff like that. It was just a matter of cost. And the more you see how Biden articulated this shit and the farewell sanctions he placed, and also the dump of ammo and weapons he gave to the Ukrainians to exacerbate the situation, is exactly that. He failed his main task, which was forcing Russia to tap out, and then it just made everything worse before leaving. For Trump, which doesn't even need that, because Trump, as I said, is an absolute wild card. You never know what's going to do. Maybe Trump's going to solve this. Maybe he's going to really make peace. But for what I'm seeing here, that's not the case. Trump is going to try something that he thinks he knows better than everyone else, but he doesn't. And his approach with Gaza and Israel, the Gaza deal, allegedly what is being said about it, shows exactly how Trump is going to try. The difference is that Israel needs the US more than the Russians need Europe at this point. And that's a huge thing to say. Right now, the trade Russia-Europe is absolutely being done despite the situation. The European leadership doesn't want to trade with Russia until whatever shit they want from Russia to happen. But they need the Russians. And Germany is testament to that. A lot of political capital is being spent, along with normal capital, is being spent just to uphold quote-unquote values. So when we go to this, how it's going to happen, and maybe it's going to be nuclear or conventional, it's going to be mostly conventional for starters, but you cannot employ equipment that is that ambiguous, like Oreshnik. Iskander is no problem. KH, no problem. It's going to be pretty logical. If they're going with KH against, I don't know, Zamosk or Ramstein, you're going to understand those are not nukes. It's just a textbook replica. But if the guy launches an Oreshnik without NOTAM, what the fuck do you think is going to happen in the mind of half of the guys that are manning the early warning systems? They're going to flag it as nuclear, and they're going to reply accordingly. Because a strike from Oreshnik based on the minimal yield would kill at least 20 to 30,000 people. Never mind the guys on the base. You're going to eradicate civilians by the fucking metric ton. So that's it. You cannot think like that. And everybody who was trying to peddle the idea that in September, October 2022, the Russians were threatening nuclear strikes, tactical nuclear strikes to stop the Ukrainians, that makes no sense. First of all, the nuclear rattling had been working for the Russians since 2022, 2021. But most importantly, where would the Russians strike? If the Russians were to use tactical nukes, they would have attacked Nikolaev and restart offensive operations. Because then they could have had a chance to take over the city. But the Russians understood that purely conventionally, there was no need to be in Kherson anymore. They failed in Mussa-raseh, they failed in March 2022. They tried to keep the positions, thinking that Ukrainians would get a trial. It didn't work, and it was sayonara, that's it. if the Russians didn't apply a tactical nuclear strike then, that would have, quote unquote, solved some of the problems they had, it's not going to happen unless, of course, something else happens, which would be like some kind of dirty bomb from the Ukrainians, or some American military leader loses his mind and orders a tomahawk strike on, I don't know, St. Petersburg or Moscow, whatever, and then, yeah, you have a huge problem. But this is not going to happen, and this is the whole point. That's why, despite everything, what was given to Ukraine is a range-limited, effect-limited arsenal. And on the other side, the Russians are doing the same, despite the fact that Kiev flies thousands of kilometers. It doesn't really fucking matter. It could be at 400 kilometers, and it would still not solve Ukraine's problems. It would still be too far for any kind of air defense they have, or air assets they have. So that's it, guys. When it comes to what kind of retaliation we're talking from the Russians, it will be mostly conventional and will mostly aimed at scoring some kind of eye for an eye. And probably it would rather aimed at the Poles than the Germans, because the Russians would rather kill off Poles than disturb German peace, as they think of the Germans as the primary customers for the gas and oil once the war is done. And we're having this echo from the AFD and Sarah Wagenknecht and all these guys. What they want is kill off the war, try to find any kind of solution that would pull Russia back in with limitations, and that's it. So by elimination, the Poles are gonna cop a bullet, probably the Baltics. It will be conventional, and then the ball would be on America's court. And probably there will not be any kind of escalation. What would happen, once again, would be then at that point, big discussions between the big boys, Orangutan and Monkey, and probably that's bad news for Ukraine. Some kind of escalate to de-escalate bullshit. That's it. Yes, Nick, up to you, man.
Kremlin kind of messaged me. I mean, we actually did kind of war game this a little bit for a number of times. I keep on telling him, like, look, if you actually get Western Air Forces involved, because there's so many airfields and also repurposable highways, like, if you want to take on an air asset in Europe, you have to make sure it stays dead, which means it goes to nuclear almost immediately. There's just no way around that logic. I mean, the thing that always kind of worried me about U.S. escalation is that they have some kind of crazy idea of just saying, well, we're just going to use NATO air forces to attack Russian assets in territorial Ukraine or the front line. And this is the kind of crazy shit that could happen, because obviously the president is a wild card, but yeah, like if that happens, then the need to take out NATO air resources would actually necessitate using nuclear weapons. I mean, you can't stop the escalation at that point. So I'm just telling Kremlin this, like, you can't hope of a conventional response to this kind of thing.
Okay. No, the reason I was thinking about this, is that what is it? There's about 150 air bases in Europe, more or less, if I'm not mistaken, excluding Turkey, obviously. And my initial thought was like, the way I thought it was like, okay, these planes need to land at one moment. Most probably they're going to be in their air bases, and you have to do like a really big attack and basically try to destroy as much shit as possible when they're on the ground, right? Kind of like Israel 1967, right? Something like that you're going to try and do. I mean, that was kind of my, how should I put it? My idea of best case scenario non-nuclear response.
Yeah, I mean, these are the things that if it happens, the other side will just obviously assume it's a nuclear attack. Like if you attack satellites, for example, and take out early warning systems, they'll assume that the next attack is going to be nuclear. I mean, these are just things that you don't trifle with because, like, if someone's coming to wipe out, dozens of air bases in one go, like, are you going to gamble that he's going to do damage that can be repaired within a few days, or do you assume that the strike is going to be permanent and really alter the military calculus? Obviously, you have to assume the worst case scenario and you have to respond accordingly. I mean, the danger is, of course, just the current administration is lack of understanding the escalation ladder. You saw that when Trump killed Soleimani and triggered all that shit that we're still dealing with right now. But again, like if they believe that Russia is weak enough or won't attempt to strike back, if NATO air assets are used to attack Russian forces inside Ukraine, well, I mean, we might be encountering that kind of calculus. So, yeah, I mean, this is the big question. Like, how is the U.S. going to, if the U.S. wants to escalate, how much is it willing to to try to get a win to not look weak, right?
Well, the problem with that is the telltale signs. You would need a huge strike package. As I said, we had a discussion in the group. At least 800 aircraft, including tankers. So that means that anywhere you want to strike in Russia, either you're going to do a front-wide attack, so you're going to fly from Sweden, Finland, Poland, Germany, and so on, which would more or less, mitigate any kind of signal you're going to have. But due to the fact that you need to go, deep enough and skirt Russian territory, when you're going to think about it properly, are you going to hit positions within Ukraine, which, internationally recognized Ukraine, which also means you're going to strike on Crimea? Well, the best way to do that is going to park 100, 120 planes somewhere in Romania. This is impossible to hide, simply because the Romanian Air Force is not big enough. Same thing for Poland. You can overload the bases in Poland. You're going to, betray your intentions. The problem with this is that the moment you betray your intentions and the Russians get trigger happy, then, as you said, you are into a huge problem, which means this is not some kind of symbolic strike. This is not a warning shot. This is not some kind of joke. This is war. And then, indeed, it's going to be nuked straight up. It doesn't even matter if it's going to cripple or not the Air Force component. You're going for blood. If the other side was stupid enough to go into this non-nuclear strike against the nuclear peer while being a nuclear force, then you're retarded. You're stupid. Because you gave up the possibility to hide behind, we attacked as a conventional force with no nukes. No, bro. You're going to go and get some nukes up your head. And then you have this other logic is that where does Russia stop? Does it just nuke the whole basis on a 800 kilometer radius from its border? Or you go for a full out MAD kind of strike? And if it's a full out MAD, what is the thinking behind it? What is the thing about, okay, they are going to try and strike us conventionally, doing some damage, even if it's extremely important. I'm not saying that this is, but what we're going to do in return is literally erase the human species out of the planet. Of course, I'm exaggerating because it's not guaranteed that a full nuclear exchange type of mad would absolutely incinerate any kind of trace of human life. It's just going to make it absolutely horrible as an existence to survive such an exchange. But are you, as a Russian or as an American, going to risk that? Because if it's not a warning, so if it's not a small strike package, outskirting Russian defenses, scoring 50 to 60 hits on different areas, be that in Crimea, some in Russia, and so forth, you may have a discussion after it, which the Russians can, as I said, in retaliation, going to hit you, I don't know, in Cyprus or stuff like that. But what if, I mean, the moment you pull your gun out and you don't use it properly, just use it in a way to threaten the other guy, and the other guy pulls out and shoots you to kill you, then why? And this is why the last 3 years have been extremely interesting, is that despite everything, despite the fact that Trump is a wild card, is a maverick, the system behind him, the military system behind him, I do not think these guys want to test the limit of survival of the American society. Because, as I said, the biggest trouble for America right now is that they will have to, even if they don't pass at all by the nuclear exchange, even just Europe, they will have to do with what they are looking at as their arch enemy, which is China. Once Europe is completely cratered, and you're going to have a, block GDP going 20, 30% less, then what?
I mean, the corralling of the Europeans, part of that is actually, I mean, it's actually highly dependent on this old Cold War commitment to forward defense, which is, how the United States also approaches Asia. I mean, basically saying how we can stand on the front line or near the front line and defend you, and you can still buy into the American system. I mean, that makes it very difficult for the United States to even take a step back here. It has to have some kind of face-saving win where it can be seen as a guardian of Europe and hasn't surrendered to Russia. So, like in this sense, like there has to be they will try to do something to eke out something they can call a win, so they can go into negotiations without looking like they tucked their tail between their legs.
Yeah, but that's the thing I told you. The problem is that what is there to negotiate? If you are dealing with how the war is going right now, it means that you will have to fight the war. The Ukrainians, as they stand right now, they're still fighting and whatever. They're still having these outbursts of counter, whatever. But at the end of the day, you don't have a Ukrainian printing machine. They don't grow on trees. Same for the Russians, by the way. So your problem here is not as much as forcing the Russians to accept a terrain reality. No, what you are trying to do to the Russians is try to choke them on their backfield. So basically, we're speaking about sanctions, we're speaking about threat of deep strikes, strategic strikes. But for each and every one of these problems, you have a reply. When it comes to deep strikes, conventional or not, as we said, it's going to be extremely complicated to explain to Russians that you are trying to have 800 NATO jets flying, and that's just going to be some conventional stuff to stop you from aggressing Ukraine. They're going to react by nukes. So, therefore, you have no leverage as a starter. When it comes to the sanctions themselves, well, the sanctions are going to work or not, but at the end, once you place them, the main core of this is if they're enforced or not. If the Russians do what the Iranians have been doing for a while now, which is seaborne transfers, you're fucked. Of course, you're going to strangle a little bit the Russian economy, but it wouldn't matter. The Chinese have proven that in these 3 years, they've went in such a huge arc of sanction evasions, having, industrial bubbles popping out in China for the Russians, having Russia industrial bubbles from the Chinese, whitewashing equipment. We spoke about when actually popped out the 122 millimeters that suddenly are using a different kind of propellant, are using different kind of shape, are like copy paste of Chinese equipment and ammunition. So when you think about it, the problem with what's going on with this war is that in my opinion, it got completely out of hand from both sides. I do not think that Putin wanted the war to last 3 years, but he was forced to do it because once you're there, you need to win. It's just a matter of winning. On the other side, as I said, I do not believe that Biden had this idea of sending hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians to die right away. His idea was, okay, short war, the Russians are thwarted, they go back for, a deal when they're not going to lose face, which is a bit what you're saying. The problem is that the Russians do not care about the face anymore right now. What they want is a victory and a strategic security architecture, because it's exactly what they're seeing. They said the Americans are going to intervene in a way or another. It happened. They said that what America wanted is to kick them out of the European energy market. It happened. Once you enter this logic and you have this thought process, there is nothing that the Americans will not do. So what they want out of this situation now is not just winning in Ukraine. They want the Americans to tap out at least partially on what they want to do, which is pulling Ukraine in NATO and reducing the Russian reach in their own near abroad to almost zero. And we're having this situation with what they're trying to do with Armenia, which is also extremely stupid because it's alienating Turkey, Iran, and Russia. We have the situation where the Syrian conflict that ended the way it ended now is in limbo because on one side the Europeans do not want to hand it to Giuliani, but on the other side they're very happy that finally that riddle with Russia there was solved. The Russians find another solution, going back to Libya and extending their reach more recently to Africa, probably hoping that the Sudanese armed forces finish off their own civil war so they can recover Port Sudan. So everything is shifting, but in Ukraine, this shift, in my opinion, so far has been completely uncontrolled. Both sides have tried to adapt. I think the Russians a little bit better than the Americans. Mostly, this has to do with the fact that, as I said, when a rabbit runs for himself to escape the dog, he runs for his life, the dog runs for his master. And in this logic, the Americans are having a proxy, and the proxy is extremely unruly. He's a coke addict, while the Russians are fighting for themselves. Of course, the problems are completely different in that sense because they're bigger, have a lot more resources than Ukraine, and also they have a simpler choice versus Ukraine in the sense that they can make their own decision despite the repercussions being directly on them. With Ukrainians, the decisions for them are being made, and sometimes they are completely contradictory with what Ukrainians want and what happens. Now, my biggest issue with the war as it stands is that Trump might very well manage to fuck up the whole deal by, trying with the wrong candidate first. So basically what Trump is going to try and do is neuter Putin first. He's going to try and pressure him and say, it's enough. You've got enough of Ukraine. We're going to discuss how much we're going to keep of it. I'm going to this and that. That's going to be offensive. And also, as you said, he had no fucking clue how it's going on the ground, which is going to also make him lose more, I'd say, goodwill points with Monkey. And then after failing there, he's going to go back to the Ukrainians, which in the best case scenario for them, they're going to be more or less where they are right now, which is slowly being bled out and being pushed away. But let's say that's the contrary. He annoys Monkey. Monkey pushes on the accelerator. The Ukrainians get the fuck out of most of the defensive positions, and they find themselves in a completely different area of defense. Then how is going to Trump solve this? And you're right to invoke and summon Soleimani, because he's going to probably try and pull out something like that. and then it doesn't work, then what? Or it does work because it's not like killing Putin or whatever, but it's something positive for once, which is like, I don't know, mediating that both sides exchange a huge chunk of their war prisoners, or they exchange a huge chunk of the bodies they hold. He might do that. He tried that for a while between the Israelis and the Arabs when he allegedly made the deal, tried to make the deal of the century. So that's the fucking problem with this guy. We can see him do the worst and the best, or at least something more positive, but we are not sure about what he's going to do. And as you said before, now his inauguration, he has the knack for finding the most absolutely batshit people out there and giving them the power to fuck up everything, but in a way that cannot be fixed afterwards. So yeah, at the end, I agree with you that it's going to be extremely complicated to convince anyone on how to, end the war, how to make a deal, and so forth. I completely agree with you. What I do not agree is that it's going to be that easy to enact some kind of first strike on the Russians without the Russians knowing, and the Americans just valtzing out there without any scratch and saying, "Oh, see, we did it. We crippled you." And the kind of administration that's coming makes it a lot more plausible what you're saying. I said it's a lot more believable that he would try something like that stupid if he gets offended by Putin because he just offended him. That's the kind of problem with bullies. They are imbued, they are completely imbued with themselves, and the first thing they're going to do, even they're not going to even fucking realize how stupid and how dangerous they sound. And then they're going to get offended when you point out that, oh, bro, you sound retarded. And once that delusion wears off, rage kicks in, or at least unhappiness, let's call it like this, discontent. And then you end up with the current situation where I think Trump's going to be between a rock and a hard place, between Zelensky that is going to try and give him all kinds of non-existing options, and Putin that's going to be stoic and say, you know what, I'm fucking the little comedian. It's up to you what you want to do. Either you put a rubber and give him some lube, or I'm going to fuck you too, That's the problem that we're having right now. We are to a point of friction between both parties that trying to mediate between them by not understanding the dynamics of the current conflict, at least the most pregnant dynamics of this conflict, is just going to make so much worse for everybody else. Russia, Ukraine, the US. So in a certain sense, it almost looks like Trump, at least on the approach, has only one shot. And that's one of the things I said initially, is that I wasn't expecting Trump to start by trying to meet Putin right away. You know how it is. Usually it's your technical teams or your negotiation teams that make a first contact, second contact, expand, try to have a working paper, initially have an agenda. Once the agenda is fixed, you check it based on how it's going on the ground. And of course you can influence on both sides, like Trump can give more weapons to the Ukrainians or pull it out. Russians can, scale back the operations from areas to, pledge goodwill, which would be retarded. And then you end up with both sides, realizing, you know what, it's better to have this deal than something else, and you go and sign it. But by Trump completely reversing the process, my problem is that, as I said, this thing might very well backfire so hard that then you're going to have exactly what happened with the Taliban. Trump got in there to allegedly kick their asses. He failed, and then we ended up with a deal that for the Americans and the American proxies in Afghanistan was a disaster. And there is no reading this guy for the moment. Yeah, sorry, it was a bit long.
Yeah, and I should also point out too that the United States is actually in a conundrum because of the rapid advance made by China in the Pacific. I don't know if you've heard about it or not, but the doctrinal change in the past couple of years in the U.S. has been this agile combat employment, which is essentially decentralizing the air bases. And of course, this creates a ton of logistical problems. But this is the bargaining phase of trying to say that, oh, we can still forward defend, all the Japan and the Philippines if we just, put small detachments of Marines with the small airstrips, all over the Pacific. I mean, it's a recognition that they no longer have the kind of the strike dominance that they used to have in the Pacific, and the priority now is survivability. So this is it's not actually, so right now it just looks like the U.S. is actually kind of on a back foot in the Pacific, and in Europe at the same time as well. This idea that we must turn things over to the Europeans. I mean, there's a fundamental problem with this, because if you think about the way the American system works and the way that the American economy works, is this being this repository for global money to purchase American financial assets. Like, in order to keep this whole thing alive, in order to keep this whole thing ticking, you have to basically convince your allies that you're there to defend them, and then that they're in return they should purchase American assets, maintain the American dollar, all these things, right? Relying on this forward defense doctrine that was already well established in the Cold War. When you think about this, the U.S. has to maintain this image of being a credible, first line defender. But the question is, in the face of all these challenges, how do they actually manage to do that? And how does somebody like Trump even manage to negotiate this very, very tough balancing act? Did I actually mute myself or what?
No. We heard you loud and clear. Yeah, that is a thing. Basically, because if you look at it, what's happening in Europe right now, it's no longer about the United States protecting Europe and basically Europe investing in the United States, right? You kind of buy from the guy who's providing the shield. You're kind of being sacrificed for the guy who should be providing you with the defense, right? So that he can, stay afloat. But meanwhile, he's also expecting you to buy from him, and also provide your own defense. So it doesn't work like that. You basically have to do twice the work and get none of the benefit, and that's not good.
Well, as I said, the problem with the US is that they are trying to gain time to fix their main issue, which is, I think Trump on that is correct. That's the funny thing with him. He has the hunches. It's just like his modus operandi is completely chaotic and useless. Trump is correct in the sense that America is being scaled back against its own will by the emergence of Asia, generally speaking. China is one part, but Asia, generally speaking, is literally sliding everybody down the rating. The problem with Trump and America in general is that they want to gain some time to let the Europeans in such a state, and therefore the whole idea of the 3.5% expenses for NATO is more a kind of forcing the Europeans to make that expense so the Americans can focus on trying to fight the economic war against China, or somehow level the playing field. But for the rest of it, the issue is that the Americans, with Asia, the Asia-Pacific situation, are what they're doing right now, especially for as long as they don't want to commit them individually in the European continent within this war that doesn't seem to end, is that at some point, any win or loss in this war, but most probably the loss, is going to be on them. I mean, just look at who is still the biggest contributor on military aid for Ukraine. It's the US. The US doesn't give. The US doesn't allow. The US doesn't find a way. Ukraine is fucked. Europe is fucked. So generally speaking here, I think the choice that the Americans want to make, which is have the Europeans, bankrupt themselves into a illusory defense of their continent against a illusory threat that's Russia, instead of having the Europeans try and find a way to coexist with both Russia and China, because there is a land connection between the two. I mean, like the railroad that brings goods from China to Europe, which is a great link. It should be the future, Instead of having the Europeans actually try and cooperate and admit that they have huge shortfalls in this relationship when it comes to China, and try to reintegrate the whole Eurasian continent instead of still looking across the sea, the Americans are managing quite well that. I mean, the Americans have managed to have the European political class being completely retarded. The European political class would rather have a cruise than have a Orient Express travel. They rather bet on overseas than overland. And this is something that the Brits did pretty well in the 19th century, when they managed to attract most of the power of interest and influence, while there were literally nobodies on the continent. If the French and the Germans wouldn't fight and the Russians wouldn't add their own stupidity in the metal during the 19th century, the British Empire would have been gone, long gone. The whole concept of nation, the whole principle, is a way to reinforce the British influence in the continent. And the Americans are doing just the same. This time they're doing it through sanctions, through pressure, economic, IP, political, military. And it doesn't really matter if it's the military matter that you're looking. The problem is that when it comes to influencing the Europeans, the Americans are on the top. And that allows them to do all the rest, which is speak about, freedom, democracy, all that bullshit. And then Biden says, we never said that we're going to have the Ukrainians regain the country. 3 years after they actually set off this awful and disastrous butchery, I mean, in a bit more than a month, it will be 3 years. And speaking about, specific details about how to defend, how to attack, America is not at that point now. If America was that strong, there would be a proxy war with China and then a full war against them. That's how the Brits took over China with the Opium Wars. First a proxy war through the East India Company, then the UK itself. So the threat with the Russians right now is way too acute due to the nukes. So they are not going to the next phase with Russia. What they want is that for some reason the Chinese pull the trigger a bit too often, jump the shark when it comes to the military aid to the Russians, so they can fleece them both with sanctions and financial hurdles to develop. And this is one thing that, we said to the group, for the Chinese, the only thing right now is let the Americans go as deep as possible in Ukraine, and then declare that, yo, you fucked up, we are officially helping the Russians. And breaking this whole nonsense of international order. And then having this discussion that the Russians are trying to have only for Europe, actually, when it comes to a security architecture, and say, you know what? You are fucking everybody in the ass. You want to be top dog, but you're not anymore. Production-wise, financially-wise, hell, population-wise. I mean, just look at the patents, the IP patents on the Chinese side. The Chinese are dominating everything. So why wouldn't China obey to a bunch of has-beens who just elected a orange retard? I'm exaggerating, of course. And I'm not saying the Chinese are better or worse. I'm just saying put yourself on their shoes, not you, because we are on the same team here. But anybody on the street, put yourself on the same shoes. You are the cornerstone of innovation on the planet Earth. You are leaps and bounds over everyone else. And still, you just get disdain from those who allegedly are the, the judges of freedom, democracy, development, and so on. I mean, for how long didn't we hear about, the debt trap from the Chinese? And when you did the analysis, 80% of the debt for most of the countries was the IMF. Whatever the Chinese would give as debt or as loans were nowhere near as bad and as systematic as the IMF ones, which were most of the time, responding to a U.S. approval. And this is not just about hypocrisy, it's not about, manipulating the global order. It's how it is right now. Some people need to actually accept and understand that it's gone. And I think this is why the Americans are still, Biden was still sitting between two chairs, because losing in Europe, so losing in Ukraine, because giving Russia even a crumpet of what it wants, is accepting defeat. Losing in Europe means that you are not able, and this is not true, that it's not because you didn't intervene in Europe, you might not, quote unquote, force China to make more drastic decisions regarding Taiwan or Korea or Asia in general. But I'm saying, politically, you sold this. Russia has lost since 2022. It ends up with Russia, quote unquote, winning, and then what? At the end, people are going to look at you and say, okay, you made a mistake, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10. Basically, you just cheat. But this is not going to come, between the Western powers. The Europeans are going to, just bow down and take it. They're just going to bend over and take it from the US. This is the whole logic now. For some reason, all these people who were between the end of the 20th century and early 21st century leaders in Europe are gone. Everybody has replaced them. They look more Americans than the Americans themselves. And it's not a question of Russophobia. It's literally these people they have their brains washed to follow up the Americans. Baron Bock literally wrote a piece of shit about how Germany wasn't doing enough for the war. Wasn't giving enough tools for Ukraine to self-destruct. You are in a logic that defies the understanding. Like, how the fuck does this even happen? You come from Willy Brandt to Kohl to Schröder to Merkel to Olaf Koch with his dominatrix Baron Bock and all these retards around him that just want things to blow up. And Scholz literally gave them 100 billion to do something with them. And the only thing these people have done with this 100 billion is buy more American shit and lose more money. And there is no enforcing of the German military. Everybody's super happy that this country, that country, that country are going to order Leopards, but the delivery schedule is up to 2037. We're speaking 13, 14 years where, and we had this joke, by the time you deliver all the Leopards, they're already obsolete. We are back to France in World War II with their whole tank concept. And if it was thousands on both sides, you would say, okay, 800 tanks per year would be nice. No, it's 12, 25. These people are mocking Russia that it cannot, quote unquote, replace the losses by building somewhere between 200 and 400 tanks and refurbishing about 1,000. It's the hilarity of this that's unpayable. So when you come and you're like, stick, and we discuss about America, it's a pastiche right now. It's a tragic comedy. Everybody who saw Desert Storm, who has read about it, who sees the level of operational capability that the Americans had back then, and compares it with now, doesn't need to, bother anymore. America remains dangerous, remains a very powerful foe, the big dog in the yard. But that staying power is being eroded every single month, and possibly every year. They are not going to get anywhere near. I mean, you pointed out the deficit in tanks and tank engines. You pointed out the downsizing when it comes to the land army itself. So what are we even discussing? Okay, when it comes to China, it's most of the fleet and long-range weapons. But when it comes to Europe, if we engage with the same kind of effect that the Russians and the Ukrainians have been engaging each other for now 3 years, the American military, due to the logistic burden, distance, and also the way they operate, would be stuck in Europe for after 2 months or 2 or 3 months. Let alone what they need to do in the Pacific. My biggest scare right now when it comes to America is that they are realizing they're fucked. And they're going to go use it or lose it. So they are going to go and try to provoke some kind of crisis that would be badly played by the Chinese in order for them to, clip them. A lot of people regard the Russian-Japanese war as a British, influence operation where they managed to get the Russians stupidly to get embroiled in this war with the Japanese while not being ready, and put the Russians back a whole decade, and ultimately just kill the Tsardom. Many are making the same kind of reference now between Russia and NATO, but I'm also thinking of some kind of similar event between the US and AUKUS and China. Okay, sorry guys, it was a bit longish, and I would like to relinquish my hand. If you have anything else to add, it's going to be fine. Otherwise, thank you very much for being here, and see you probably on Friday.